Central banks around the world are trying to manage a situation where increasingly people are worried about the risk of rising inflation. Do you think that's a real risk?
It is something that is a risk that certainly has to be managed. I think the major central banks have the tools to be able to work their way out of the extraordinary liquidity provision without having inflation, but it is something to watch very closely.
Why do you think so many central bankers are confident that they can manage inflation? We've had hyperinflation around the world in the past where central banks haven't been able to stem the flow. But now we've got a very confident message coming from the central banks. What is it that's different this time around?
I think, one, many central banks are more independent than they had been in the past, so they don't have as many pressures to just monetize the debt, because that has been a real problem, especially in emerging market countries. That was an enormous problem when you didn't have central bank independence and you just forced the central bank to buy the government debt. Unfortunately, we're seeing some challenges in Argentina and a few other countries like that, but broadly the central banks are more independent than they had been. And second, there are more tools to be able to deal with this. In particular, in the U.S., we received a new tool at the Federal Reserve to be able to pay interest on reserves, and that's going to be a very effective way to try to keep reserves in the system, because you can pay more interest on them. You can give a higher rate of return of keeping the reserves in rather than lending them out, which turns into money supply growth, which turns into inflation.
I was at a conference yesterday when people were saying that actually central bank independence is not possible in a time of crisis. As soon as there's a time of crisis, you realise that central banks have to be brought back under political control. I guess you would argue against that.
Well, I think there's a big difference between political control and close cooperation with other authorities in government. In a crisis, I don't think it's appropriate to say, well, we can't talk to you, we're independent of you. I think it's very important to be talking with the fiscal authorities, the Exchequer, at Treasury, at finance ministries, to be talking with other regulators and be talking with other central banks and other governments around the world, because it's a worldwide problem, it's a real challenge, and to understand what they're doing is very important to understand what the appropriate monetary policy would be. So I would say increasing communication and discussions are important, but maintaining the independence of the central banks is still crucial.
So all in all, you're reasonably confident that at the moment the world central banks have the tools in place to be able to stop the risk of hyperinflation? Yes,
I think they do in the major countries and also in the emerging market countries that have had more of a recent experience with high inflation or even hyperinflation. They're very sensitive to that issue. Does that mean that everyone will work it through perfectly? I'm sure not, but I think there's so much more learning that's gone on over the last few decades that we're likely to be able to handle this better than we have in the past.